Hey, everybody, and welcome to the Continuous Compliance Podcast. I'm here with Darren Thomson and Jakub Lewandowski, who are both members of our Commvault team. And I'm going to let them introduce themselves. We have a very hot topic to talk about today. Darren, how about you introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me, Danielle. I'm Darren Thomson. I work as a field CTO in the Europe and Middle East and Africa region for Commvault. So I spend my time mostly talking to executive level representatives from our customer base and our prospect base, and largely about strategic topics, largely security and resilience strategy. And really spend most of my time, I guess, changing perceptions with regards to how to properly protect yourself from emerging threats and current threats like ransomware.
Thanks. I'm really glad you're here. And how about Jakub?
Thanks for having me as well. I'm the Associate General Counsel for EMEA here at Commvault, and I predominantly deal with data governance, all regulations that are data related, whether it being privacy, information security, cybersecurity, cyber resilience, data sovereignty, data localization. That would be within my scope. So yes, thank you.
I'm glad you're both here. So quite recently in the news, we have been learning about a breach that happened at Oracle and a ransomware. What do you guys think about what happened at Oracle? How do you think about how Oracle is communicating it? And what do you think about their decision not to make a ransomware payment? I'm going to start with Darren.
Yeah, good question, Danielle, and very topical, obviously. I mean, the Oracle breach or alleged breach, I guess, is definitely still in flux. I don't think anybody, possibly including Oracle themselves, know precisely what the blast radius is or what the actual effects are. My experience tells me we're going to, in terms of where Oracle say they currently are and where the criminals say where they've got to, we're going to be somewhere in between. It'll be worse than Oracle are saying it is, and not as bad as the criminals are making out. It looks very much like they've breached the traditional Oracle environment as opposed to the cloud environment, but that remains to be seen. I guess the topic of ransomware payments is pretty topical. At some point you probably want to talk about potential ransomware payment bans here in the UK. Look, the advice I give people is that you should have a good enough plan in place that you never need to consider paying ransom. That's really where everybody should be striving to get to. The do or do not pay ransom question would not exist in businesses if they had adequate, tested, and audited plans in place so that they were 100% confident they can get their minimal viable companies back quickly enough. The reality is most people aren't in that situation, so they have to consider a ransomware payment. So the world's not a perfect place. People pay ransoms. People make the decision not to pay ransoms. But I would always advise people that are even considering paying one to consider a worst case scenario, because we see plenty of examples of ransoms being paid and companies being really no further forward in terms of recovery of their data. So I would support Oracle's decision not to pay the ransom. That's always the right decision. I hope they have plans in place and continue to investigate this breach to the point where there's a minimal blast radius as possible, really.
Well, that's very interesting because in Oracle's case, in addition to bricking data, there was also a threat to release customer information publicly if the ransom wasn't paid. In that case, a cyber resilience plan to get you back up and running doesn't help you. You're at risk of, leaking customer information and data that Oracle is has a responsibility, a legal responsibility to keep confidential. So, Jakub, how do you advise your management team? How do you advise a board of directors when there's a ransomware attack and they are threatening to release data that you have a legal obligation to keep confidential?
It's not an easy situation to be in. Obviously, it's about taking the right decision on what to do. There are no straightforward answers here. It's more of a cost benefit decision that needs to be made considering a lot of circumstances, a lot of factors. Ransomware is a multidimensional phenomenon, and responding to such phenomenon also requires a multidisciplinary approach. So you need to look at technical aspects, you need to look at legal aspects, you need to look at economical aspects, and that's what we'll I believe we'll get to discuss in more details in connection with the proposal that's on the table in the UK. But you need to consider reputational damages, impact on business continuity, obviously, the ransom amount requested by the bad actor. And I think that single most important factor is, as Darren said, are you confident in your cyber resilience capabilities? Are you confident? Do you have trust that you're able to bounce back after the incident, that you are able to restore your data? And specifically from legal perspective, obviously you need to consider things like recording your decision-making process. Why have you taken certain paths? Why have you taken certain decisions and not the others? This will serve as evidence for regulators. This will also, or this might also be very useful in case of litigation that could follow, right? Used available experts, whether it's cooperate with your vendors. I know when you're being hit with a ransomware attack, you don't know who to trust at that point, right? Seek organization that established trust in the entire system. Look for organization like NCSC, law enforcement. This is definitely your ally in responding to a ransomware attack. Finally, consider, if you're considering to pay ransom, anti-money laundering legislation, sanction regimes, export compliance, all of this is something you need to consider. And as the case is with the proposals on the table in the UK, government and the regulators actually see some way that they can help organizations throughout that process.
Very interesting and very complicated. And you both have very strong points of view. So I'm going to put you through a hypothetical for just a second. What both of you are referencing is that the UK government plans to expand its ban on ransomware payments to include the entire public sector and operators of critical national infrastructure. UK has described this proposal as world-leading because they believe that this will enable them to cut off the flow of payments to criminals. And a lot of industry and security experts are supportive of this proposal. So here is my question, and it's to both of you. You advise the UK government, and the UK government has received a ransomware attack. They are going to unleash personal identifiable information and personal health information of millions of citizens unless a ransomware payment is made. And you have 3 days, 72 hours to make the decision. How do you advise the UK government, assuming that this ban is in place and knowing what the impact will be to your citizens? I'll start with you, Darren.
Yeah, I mean, it's a conundrum, Danielle, isn't it? Part of my sort of commentary around this potential payment ban in the first place is you need to be sure that people are ready to comply. And what I mean by that is, I mentioned having a robust recovery plan. I didn't mention having a just generally robust resilience plan. So that would include things like data encryption, for example, right? So if you're talking about a government that has a robust resilience and recovery plan in place, the advice to them should be fairly simple, which is go to your playbook. You've already defined your incident response reaction here. You have a team in place. You need to follow the plan. I suspect, I don't know, but I suspect that the UK government, like many other organisations, are not in that position. Perhaps all of the data that should be encrypted is not heavily encrypted. Perhaps people don't know exactly what their roles and responsibilities are. Perhaps those playbooks are not well defined, in which case that government would find themselves in the unfortunate position that many others are going to in the public sector if this ban were to come into place, which is they don't have an option to pay because it's illegal, and they have, probably need to suffer a month or two of downtime recovering as best they can the situation they're in. That is the reality on the ground. I'm not against this type of a ban, but I think there are unintended consequences which we can talk about in more detail that need to be considered before it's imposed. Because my experience, for example, of the public sector in the UK is they do not have the richest security budgets on the planet, right? There are other sectors that are much better off, frankly, and therefore logically are more mature in terms of their security and cyber defense mechanisms. And so be careful what you wish for. You could put this ban in place and there could be some unintended consequences that are going to be hard to live with.
So Jakub, I'm going to pose the question to you, and now I'm going to tweak it just a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
In 72 hours, citizens' personal health and personal identifiable and financial information will be released. In the first 24 hours, the attackers gave UK government officials an example of what they have to prove that they do have this information. And they're asking for a £2 million ransom, totally affordable. How do you advise the government officials?
Okay, it's worth noting that most of the governments, even if they don't have an outright policy banning any ransomware payments, they have a policy which states do not negotiate, and they will be forbidden from negotiating. Now, how exactly is this enforced? That's one of the issues we also have. We're really not having full visibility of the entire ransomware landscape, and that's what the proposal is also about. I'm not sure if anyone is able to come up with a single response, with an outright response saying pay or not to pay with limited information that you have. It will all boil down basically to your confidence. What I said before, to your confidence in your cyber resilience capabilities. Personally, not being in that situation specifically, but looking from the outside, it's much easier to say avoid that, right? This kind of fuels the entire payment cycle. It fuels the organization. So in the long run, the key thing is breaking from that ransomware payment cycle. And that leads me to only one conclusion: do not pay.
It's fascinating. I have really made it difficult for the two of you with this proposal, and you both sort of are steadfast. And you're not steadfast for the reason of, well, if the UK passes a law, we have to follow the law. You are thinking through, future implications of paying a ransomware ban. Let's talk for a second as data security experts, and just take this to its logical conclusion. The ransom is not paid, and millions of citizens' data is leaked. What next?
Well, we see this every day. I mean, it's not like this wouldn't be the first time that PII has escaped and gone places it shouldn't go. One of the most terrifying things about this profession we're in, I find anyway, that what keeps me awake at night is where all that stuff goes, right? I mean, it wasn't long ago we were talking about the SolarWinds attack, the Kaseya attack. If you go back even further than that, the huge data losses in various organizations around the world. And there's an initial kind of media maelstrom, and we all kind of panic a little bit. And then we kind of forget all that data's gone and it's out there, and we never really understand where it went. And I suspect this would be another instance of that, right? Unfortunately, it's very, very difficult to understand once data is leaked what the impacts are. We can measure certain cybersecurity impacts, downtime, loss of revenue, things of that nature. But when it comes to data exfiltration, it's a difficult one because we don't know where it's gone. We don't know who, if anybody, buys it from the black markets. We don't know how it's then leveraged. So what we can really do, and this is an example, really a government example, so we can talk about, the customers or citizens in this case. All we can really do is put all of our attention into advising those citizens as to how to best mitigate the risk that now exists as a result of this breach to their personal identities and their finances. That's all the obvious things. It's changing passwords. It's making sure that we're as clear and transparent as we can be about what the data was, so that they can effectively sort of mitigate as much risk as possible. But this, unfortunately, this wouldn't be the first time masses and masses of PII has escaped, and it won't probably be the last either. Which is why I think both Jakub and I are on the same page, which is, look, if we're ever going to sort of end this cycle, this vicious cycle of, criminals earning lots of money and therefore continuing to invest in ransomware, then we've got to break it at source. Now, I do want to talk about some implications potentially of that, but that's kind of how I think about this.
Jakub, when a company suffers a ransomware attack, whether they pay the ransom or not, and information that they were legally required to keep confidential is leaked, they face regulatory investigations and fines. Does the UK government face the same for itself when they're a victim? And how do you think about how regulations might need to evolve?
This is a great question. So first thing to understand, paying ransomware does not fulfill your regulatory obligations. It's not considered a risk mitigation. So it doesn't mean the moment you pay, you're off the hook from all the legal obligations out there, including notifying incidents, complying with all possible applicable laws in that case. Historically, legislators have taken various approaches. So we started with criminalizing certain activities and practices for example, hacking. For example, there are a lot of examples. Another big brick of those, another big bulk of the ideas was around ramping up the cyber resilience capabilities. If you look at NIS2, if you look at DORA, all of those are examples where legislators are enforcing more investment and a wiser investment into cybersecurity capabilities. Now, this new proposal is something else. This is looking at the whole ransomware phenomenon from the economical side, deterring bad actors from the attacks. And it actually, the proposal itself contains a breakdown of the ransomware payment cycle, and it's very interesting. So obviously it starts with the attack, then we get to the negotiations. You start negotiating with the bad actor whether to pay or not to pay. Then, assuming you decide to pay, what happens? You pay, the funds from that payment are being channeled to the bad actors. They're obfuscated along the way. Think of it in money laundering terms. Then they're being cashed out. And finally, they're used to resource to cause or to initiate new ransomware attacks. The only place where you can break that cycle is those points 2 and 3. So negotiations and payment. And the good and interesting thing to kind of see how it all plays element is obviously this has a chance of succeeding because UK government has this first mover's advantage. So from bad actors' point of view, it will be easier to attack organizations that are not subject to that ban. And that might cause simply that the ransomware attacks will focus or will shift to different sectors or different countries, maybe. It's not that the whole thing will cease to exist, right? It will continue to happen. But as a the public sector might be actual beneficiary of those actions. So really interesting to see how that plays out. The consultations are there for 4 more days until April 8th. I expect kind of 2 main types of responses. One will be around the organizations needing to step up their cybersecurity game, increase their capabilities, increase or improve their response and recovery. The other group will be around of responses will be around better control over what's going on with the payments, deterring payments, controlling, especially or putting additional controls in terms of ransomware payments. So let's see how that plays out.
Okay, I'm gonna go to Darren one final time. It's something you said I have been thinking about, which is we're not really sure what the impact of the data leakage is. We're not really sure where it's going. We're not really sure what the leakage itself, the harm that it's doing. And I'm thinking about this, and I'm thinking, you know, when Jakub is advising a company that is facing a ransomware attack, that's facing an imminent threat of leakage of information, what he told us is he's thinking about, you know, regulatory implications. He's thinking about, you know, litigation from potential, you know, customers who have been impacted. And these are all punitive measures against a company for having been the victim of an attack. If you set that up as number one, number two is, and yet we're not sure what the leakage of that data's impact practically is. We're not sure what the harm actually is. You could, this is kind of wild, but you really could get to a place in your head that says, we just have to assume that these attacks will continue to happen. We have to have a cyber resilience strategy to stay in business, right? Because we can't be harmed by it. But we also should not be imposing more harm to companies as a result. Because if you could remove the litigation angle, if you could remove the regulatory fines, it becomes a very unfortunate event where you are not sort of going after the victims. And you kind of might even take the sting out of the attack to begin with. Now, that all assumes that there isn't an impact that we understand when the data is leaked. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, look, Danielle, this is a multi-dimensional issue and therefore needs multi-dimensional solution, right? It is part of that multi-dimensional solution taking the attractiveness away from criminals around things like ransomware. That ransomware is very easy to do nowadays. You don't need to be a technician to stage a ransomware attack, and it's very, very financially beneficial. So that's a recipe for addiction for a criminal. Is there something we can do about that? Absolutely. And so potentially ransom bans could be part of the solution. But that in itself, you know, my view is there will absolutely be unintended consequences to that. And those unintended consequences will be even more drastic if we don't think holistically about this, right? So what are the other parts of the jigsaw puzzle? Well, there are many, but one of them we've referred to already. So how mature is your cyber resilience program? You know, do you really understand your data? If we go back to your comment about data exfiltration and us not knowing what happens to it, well, I feel differently about different types of data. And the data that I felt very strongly about 10 years ago, I don't feel strongly about now. Like if somebody steals my credit card information and I know that, so to my point earlier, there's transparency, I change my credit card. It's not that big a deal, right? There's a window of opportunity for a criminal. They probably make the most of that, right? But I'm probably, the bank hopefully will help me and I'll change my credit card, right? If on the other hand, what's being stolen, I don't know, is a vaccine recipe that could save humanity, that's a whole different ball game, isn't it? You know, it's a different kind of data. And so this whole idea of data classification, understanding our data better, is part of the solution. That in itself is part of good cyber resilience programming, planning, recovery planning, the testing of what would happen. How, you know, most organizations I speak to do not realistically test a worst case scenario. They don't test themselves in that way. They go through the motions. They send their employees kind of checkbox exercises to make sure they can spell ransomware, but they're not really living it. They're not really immersing themselves in the consequences in a way that makes the board level folk that have got the purse strings react in a meaningful way and invest in the right way. So that's part of the solution, right?
What's funny is when you say that, Darren, I think, how many times have you and your family done a fire drill in your house?
Right, it's human nature not to bother, isn't it? You know,
Right.
but so although you'd be surprised because I live in our house and I'm pretty dangerous, so we do that quite often. But yeah, so look, it's a multi-dimensional problem. The ransomware ban thing's interesting. I think just to very quickly talk about the unintended consequences. Jakub mentioned one already. We're just going to shift attention to other sectors, right? So that's one problem. We could drive the payments underground. So you know, I loved your sort of thought experiment earlier, Danielle. What if this was the UK government? Well, I don't know what would happen, but I suspect that if they wanted to, they could pay it without anybody noticing. Well, that could happen elsewhere as well, right? I mean, there are already underground systems that will broker that transaction for folk without anybody knowing, right? So we could just drive this whole thing kind of underground. You know, we could delay incident reporting whilst people are considering, you know, kind of their options now that this is, you know, this ban's in place. We could see less collaboration with law enforcement rather than more collaboration, because now we know it's illegal for a fact, and so the last thing we want to do is immediately, you know, notify the authorities. So there's all kinds of unintended consequences here, and I really hope, you know, this is not, as Jakub's the expert here in law, but my understanding is that this is still being talked about in the UK. This is not in place yet. You know, I really hope the UK government take the time to receive the right consultation here, so they at least understand some of these unintended consequences before the ban is imposed.
That's an extremely interesting thought, Darren, if I may chip in on this one. So about the unintended consequences, I think the biggest problem laying ahead of the legislators now that this proposal is on the table is fighting with this optics of punishing victims. So these organizations are already punished in some form or the other, right? And here, potentially, there are additional burdens, additional issues that they will need to tackle, dealing with a life and death situations for a lot of organizations. So that is a thin line that needs to be considered during those consultations.
I totally agree. And look, in cybersecurity, my view is that context is everything, right? And so if a government department or a public service is disrupted, and that's, you know, somebody's lost some credit cards or some library details, that's one thing. If there's an attack on a hospital and lives are at stake, that's a completely different thing. And so what I don't like about this sort of legislation is it's one size fits all. Like, we are just banning ransomware payments. That's the law, regardless of the context and regardless of the situation. That, in my view, is dangerous, because context is absolutely everything. And for those that haven't lived the breach, you know, it isn't quite as easy as where my morals live, and therefore morally what I think is right. You know, that there are lots of other factors at play here.
Any final thoughts? If there was one thing you wanted the listeners to take away from our conversation, what would you leave them with?
I think the critical question to respond to in order to properly tackle the problem of ransomware payments is understanding or following the old principle of follow the money, right? Who is making the payment? Where is the money going to? Why, when, how much, and through what means? And I think the UK government is on the right track trying to address this concern, since other methods are complementary. They all can work together, but so far they have been failing us.
Thank you. Darren.
Yeah, I think I would draw the attention back to the organizations that potentially become the victims. I think is incredible. My experience of the past really 5 years has been an awful lot of attention in cybersecurity has gone into what I refer to as the blocking and the tackling. So that's to your point earlier, Danielle. Let's try and stop the attack. That would be a good idea. And if the intruder were to get into the network, let's detect that as quickly as possible. So hopefully we can do something about it. Now, nothing wrong with doing those things, but they're not working. People are still being breached every week, right? And the reason that that's important is because when we see a breach, it's taking people anything up to a month or 2 months sometimes to recover their business. And for some business, that's the end of business, right? And so there's nowhere near enough attention right now on what do we do when the worst happens and we need to recover from that. And we've touched on some of the facets of that. That's understanding my data properly, understanding what's really important, defining my minimal viable company, building a plan, building a playbook, building a team, having a facility to test my plan, really test it, not on a tabletop, but really test my plan, its architectures, its data structures, its application structures. And so I think if as much effort goes into that side of things as has gone into the blocking and tackling over the past 15 years, we're all going to be in much better shape. And actually to not or pay a ransom will be less of a conversation, because again, hopefully there will be a more robust conversation around here's a plan we can rely on, and we can at least get minimal viable company in short order. So paying this criminal is not on our agenda. That's where I hope we get to.
What I love about this podcast, and this is the third one that we've done, is that there's two ways to put something like this together. You bring experts to the table and they sort of tell you what they know. We could have described what the UK ban is, and we could have described what ransomware is, and it would have been very 101. But what I like about this podcast is when you bring experts to the table and you really force them to work through a complicated issue and see how they would come out, like the two of you. See how you would advise the UK government in a lose-lose situation. And to me, that is interesting when people are listening and trying to figure this out for themselves as they're going through it. So I appreciate you guys so much. I appreciate the fact that I gave you absolutely no preparation for the hard questions I was going to throw at you. And thanks for the time.